I picked the topic, stucco, not for any great reason other than it seems like architects really love stucco. I'm an engineer, so I'm kind of agnostic in that regard, siding or stucco. But I don't know. You two are both architects. You tell me. It seems like architects just absolutely love stucco. Am I crazy on that?
I think you're 100% right. It's durable, and you can put it into any shape you really need.
Yeah.
Profiles.
It's funny. People have such mixed feelings about it. It's so polarizing. There's anytime I teach on stucco, some people will respond to whatever it is I've taught, and I'm talking about something I'm making some technical point, and some of the comments, this is often on Instagram, the comments I'll get are like, well, stucco sucks, just don't ever use it. Like, okay, well, not super helpful. But no, it is. I agree. It's durable, and it's some of the best buildings in the world. The most beautiful buildings in the world are stucco buildings. So
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
I should mention, by the way, before we go too far along, I'm pretty sure the ICAA is going to follow up like after this and like get everybody's name and what you do and this and that, so they can like incorporate all that at the beginning. So that's why I skipped all the introduction stuff. But you two, I guess, don't really know each other. Mark, that's Christy. Christy, that's Mark.
I know you, Mark, because Foster sent a cool article about you. You're so cool, so I'm impressed. I feel inadequate. I think our educational experiences were quite different.
No, and Foster sent me on you as well, so I'm very excited to chat with
I
you
feel
today.
like between the two of us in architecture school, we would bookend the entire class, like top of the class, bottom of the class.
Well, this is
But
All bases
perfect.
covered here.
there's room
Yeah.
for us. There's room for us both in the profession. The building industry is
Exactly.
big.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, if you two don't mind, I'm going to start with my stucco story from about a year ago, and then we'll see where it leads. But I got a call. All the work I do these days is, I'm a building scientist,
Mm-hmm.
so I get plan review calls. I get calls from construction companies to help them with things or help them out of problems, and sometimes homeowners, same thing. But anyway, this was from a contractor who had just started a renovation job in Armonk, New York, on a mid-century modern, like a classic. I think it was from 1927 or so. So I guess maybe that makes it an old mid-century modern, but a very classic, what I would have called a classic mid-century modern, meaning it was modern design, kind of that,
Clean lines.
yeah, like low and long,
Mm-hmm.
all flat roofs, overhangs, that sort of thing, but all stucco, right? A pure white stucco, and lots of it exposed all over the place, and big square windows and blah blah blah. And they called me in because they'd started the renovation, and it was basically like the typical suburban renovation, like new kitchen, a bunch of new bathrooms, and change out all the windows, right? Like, and
Mm-hmm.
a couple other minor things. Well, when they pulled all the drywall off the exterior walls, they discovered that, I'm going to say, 30% of the exterior walls just looked rotten from the inside. I mean, like, some places you could see the backside of the stucco, like the wood sheathing
Just
was
disintegrated. Gone.
gone. Yeah. So, of course, they talked to the architect first, and the architect was like, whatever, deal with it, basically. And so they called me, and eventually I wrote a report for them, and blah blah blah. But it was, first of all, apparently I've seen plenty of wood rot in my career, but this was somewhat shocking because it was so extensive. Um, but it did all the things. Like when I walked in, I said to these fellows, well, like, oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Here's what's going on, I think. And by the way, you're going to find that the north wall is more
It's
rotten
gonna be the
than
worst. Yeah.
the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And son of a gun, it was. And they had made, I mean, like whoever built the place had made a lot of classic mistakes. And the one I'll start with is they ran the stucco just straight into the ground, right? Like And I'd like to hear from you two architects on this. Like, why is it designers hate to have like a break between the way things look above grade and the way things look either going into or below grade?
That's
for you, Mark.
So nice to have that stucco just run straight into the ground. You know it's going to cause problems. No, I mean, I think, when we're looking at the profile of the building against the grade, hate to see that stepping look and showing the actual masonry behind it or whatever the substrate is. But yeah, I know it's so important to keep it off the ground.
Well, stucco material itself, I think, is perfectly capable of being in the ground. In fact, it's not a horrible material to be in the ground and be wet. And just so that whoever may listen to this off in the future, like the ground is a problem because the ground is always wet. The general rule is if anything green is growing, at the very best, the air in all the little air pockets between all little grains of sand and whatever is at 100% relative humidity, which is a big number. It's hard to get bigger than 100%. In fact, that's how high it is. But usually, ignoring that it's just incredibly humid below ground, it's usually actually wet, like water wet.
Well, and you'll also find that people want to do this crazy thing where they plant things close to their houses and then they irrigate it and they add sprinklers to the
What are
ground.
they thinking?
I don't know. It's crazy people.
But anyway, where I was going was like I don't find stucco itself to be a bad material to get wet and be below ground. But the problem is it's incredibly good at moving water around and holding water itself. So it moves that water from below ground to above grade, and then it gets the wood wet, and then the wood rots, and then everything goes to hell. And that's where people seem to have missed the boat back in 1927 on this house, or at least one of the places. So,
well, I think the big distinction ends up being like we judge something aesthetically, or we judge two things that look the same but are built differently as working the same way, or we understand it that way, and that's not really true. So stucco applied on a masonry structure will perform very differently than stucco applied over a framed structure. So you're describing problems with running stucco all the way into the ground when you've got a wood framed structure, and that's different than a stucco directly applied to solid masonry, which is more common on the beautiful classical buildings that we see all over Europe, and the framed stuff is much more common in the United States. And
great point. Yes.
yeah, the problem is when we confuse the detailing required for, we detail stucco over framed walls as though they were mass walls, and that doesn't work out, because there's the water management strategy of the wall is just really different. With mass walls, we essentially, the water management strategy is, well, we go ahead and let things get wet, and then we let the wall dry in both directions. So it has a tremendous capacity to store water, to redistribute water, and then it'll dry to the inside and it'll dry to the outside. No big deal, no harm, no foul. With wood framed structures, our walls are lighter and hollow and made of wood, which is moisture sensitive. And what we need to do is provide drainage between the stucco and whatever we're using as our water control layer. And because we don't have that same capacity to store and redistribute water that we did in the mass wall, so we have to provide some capacity for drainage and drying in between that stucco and the framed wall, and that requires all kinds. There's other implications to that, especially aesthetic implications, right? What that means is if we've got a drainage layer behind our stucco, we have to provide ways for that water that gets behind the stucco and goes down that drainage plane to drain out, which means we need through wall flashings, which provides that interruption at the bottom of the wall, and it interruptions. We need head flashings now. We need, at any
Well,
kind of overhangs and setbacks, we need through wall flashings, and that's an aesthetic bummer.
well, Christy, let me ask you a question, because I run into this a lot. And you just alluded to the it thing I'm about to talk about. I always get the impression that most designers and most contractors believe that the outside face of their stucco is like that's their water control layer, and that's where they're stopping water, and that's it. And that bleeds over into all sorts of other areas in other materials and other assemblies, meaning whenever I'm talking about window installations, even with window installers that work on, some very nice projects with very expensive bronze windows, it's just clearly drilled into their head, like, seal it on the outsides, outside,
Yeah,
outside,
yeah.
outside. And like that whole concept of drainage cavity doesn't seem to, like, clearly you've got it right, you understand it, I get it. Mark, for sure, Mark gets it, there's no doubt about it. But um it doesn't seem like it's really like got embedded into our industry yet, right?
No, it really doesn't. It's so, like, the intuitive idea that what you see is also, like, the aesthetic, the exterior finish that you see is also performing the primary water management function on the wall, on whatever it is so, it's such a strong, I guess, bias. It's such a strong belief that it's really, really hard to try to explain to people that that works sometimes on a very, on a minority of buildings, but not, it doesn't work that way on framed buildings. We have this other layer behind it. And even though a lot of architects that I teach, they know that. They know that they've got a water control layer behind their cladding, no matter what the cladding is, whether it's stucco, whether it's brick, whether it's a panelized system, whatever. They know they've got their WRB. They've got it behind there. It's mandated by code. They'll include it behind stucco. But the perception, again, is so strong, and that perception is, well, I'm including this WRB as a backup, in case my stucco cracks or fails, in case my stucco contractor, the guy who installs it, isn't very good at his job. So and it's for when I get a leak and when I get a crack in the stucco 50 years from now. But the
Right.
reality is we get little micro cracks on day one.
Yeah.
And it's not a lot of water gets past stucco, in fact, but it doesn't require a lot of water to damage wood-based materials if that water is what we call perched right up against it. So
Yeah.
if it's held up against even the WRB, then we have real problems, and the pressure drives it. We get vapor pressure, and we get hydrostatic pressure. It'll find its way in through actual holes, through fasteners, because we have to mechanically fasten the lath, or if we fasten the sheathing itself up, it finds all kinds of holes there. But then also it just sits there and saturates the wood, and then you'll get
So
rot.
let me ask you two questions there. Like, normally I tell people, like, I think 5% of the water that hits a wall goes into the assembly and makes it to the drainage area. Now, realistically, that's probably a bigger number than it really is, but it's a nice, easy, round number, 5%. You got any sense of that?
I
Whether
think I actually don't really know. ASHRAE, I think, estimates like 1% when they give you guidance on making models. If you're going to do a
right,
WFI model or whatever, it gets you to assume that 1% gets, or maybe it's that 10% gets past the cladding, and then 1% gets past the WRB, whatever it
oh,
is.
okay, yeah,
I don't, they've got some sort of equation. You could look it up if you needed to. I just assume that anything will get past, like, just,
right.
I assume lots of it gets past there, and that and I don't worry about, I guess there's really two I find this to be a particularly useful concept when I teach on this very topic, is that in order to have a leak, you've got to have four things, 4 conditions. One is you need a source of water, which is rain. The second is we need a pathway for water to get from the outside from somewhere that it is to somewhere where we don't want it to be. The third thing we need is some sort of driving force to push water along that pathway. And then the fourth thing we need is something to get damaged as a result. And what we tend to do is focus only on that second thing. We focus only on the pathways, or we obsess about the pathways. And unfortunately, that means that we neglect these 3 other things that we have, that we can, strategies that we can adopt in different scenarios, right? We can practice source control by only building in Las Vegas. No, by overhangs and lintels and like facade water management strategies to reduce how much water a wall will even see. Excuse me, and then on the third and fourth approaches, we can reduce the driving force that pushes water along those pathways. And on walls, that the biggest driving force that we usually have to contend with is hydrostatic pressure. And what that is, hydrostatic pressure sounds really fancy. Consultants use it all the time to, I think, intimidate people. But basically, all it is gravity. And it's the force exerted on a horizontal surface by water when water is held up against that surface. So if you take a cup that you're drinking from and you put it sideways and hold it against the wall, the water that's in your cup, assuming you seal the edges, will exert an inward pressure on that wall. And that's hydrostatic pressure. We measure it usually in inches. And anyway, the short version of this is, if we don't allow water to become perched against a wall, there's no pressure to push it inside along the pathways. So just because you have a pathway doesn't mean water's actually, because you have a hole essentially, doesn't mean water's actually going to go through that hole. So if you relieve the pressure, you don't need to, you can have pathways, and we have tons of pathways. We're never perfect about sealing our WRB and our penetrations, and there's some stuff we can't seal, right? You can't seal the lath after it's in. That's blind fastened in place. But if you don't have a pressure, you don't have a problem. And then we can also build with non-moisture sensitive materials sometimes. I mean, we're not going to stop building with wood, so we can't really
Can you
avoid that.
dispel a certain myth that I hear regularly out on job sites for me?
Okay.
It's along the lines of this driving forces, pressure, right? So you just talked about hydrostatic pressure being the big one. One of the things I regularly hear from contractors is, well, let's turn off the HVAC system to, so we don't get a negative pressure in the room, and that won't suck water in then.
Wait, really?
It's been my experience that no HVAC system in the history of HVAC systems, and no fan in the history of fans, has ever caused a water leak, through a wall assembly.
Yeah, like what kind of fan is this? It's like
So this is your opportunity to dispel that myth. Like, fan pressures don't cause
I don't
leaks
even know if
through
somebody said
walls.
that to me on a job site. I don't even know how I would.
Oh
I
yeah,
don't.
and
I don't
it
even know
comes
what
up.
I would say.
Where I hear it most is houses that are on the water. And of course, there's some leak, which normally is because they screwed up some flashing somewhere, or God knows what. But then they'll say, like, they'll start talking about the fans, and like, well, they have a big kitchen and they cook a lot, and that must be one of the reasons. And it's surely not our
I
fault. It's
have
because
never. That is crazy. What's the only way I can kind of think of that as being true? I mean, it's not true in that it's sucking water, but sometimes when we're designing like natatoriums
yep,
or indoor pools, if you screw that up, if the pressure in the pool is positive, it doesn't matter how well you enclose it. Like you're pushing air
Yeah,
You're pushing
got it.
air, humid air with chemicals in it out.
Especially when Mark's parents out in Minnesota there get us to build a natatorium at his house where it's
But that's
0
air.
degrees outside.
Like
Yeah,
that's air. You push air. Like that's air.
right.
That's not. You're not pushing the pool water
Yeah.
out
So I mean,
into adjacent
I'm not
room.
crazy. Like a quarter inch of water in a little drop stuck on top of a stucco nail is way more pressure than your kitchen exhaust fan is ever going to exert.
Oh yeah, and I mean, you can look at that. Maybe this helps if you pull up the chart showing the equivalencies for inches of water to miles per hour of wind.
Yeah, right.
So what is it like? An
Well,
inch of water equates to just under a 50-mile-an-hour wind,
yeah, well, it's a
45
little
miles
bit
an hour roughly.
pretty close. Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah,
yeah,
so I mean, eh,
yeah,
that's a lot.
right,
What
exactly.
kind of pressure are you really getting when you turn on the fan? Are you
Uh,
not that?
nowhere close. But anyway, I just wanted to this like
Like
you
you
could
can
get.
feel a 45-mile-an-hour wind.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, this was just like I wanted to publicly dispel this rumor that mechanical fans contribute to water leaks in walls, and I'm like, no, 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 no. You got
the
other
the
issues.
the one I guess the toughest one I come across is this idea of barriers. People really have this idea that even that their water control layer should be completely impervious. So not even just their cladding, but the WRB, like no water should ever get behind that. And even, unfortunately, I think manufacturers kind of play into this, where they're marketing their product, that their marketing materials, I think, are really misleading. And in that I don't know, it convinces people that these things are pass fail. And that's really not true. I try to tell people that to remember and to even memorize this, that in order for you to have a water problem, the wetting your wall experiences has to exceed the entire wall's capacity to store and redistribute water for long enough to damage the materials that that compose it. And
Yeah,
if that's not true, so it has to get wet, stay wet long enough that something gets damaged. Not like just because you see a little water that gets past whatever the layer is, doesn't mean you have a failure. You have a failure if you have that happen too much. And that's why we have to use these 4 things, right? Source control with water management on the facade. You seal the pathways as best you can. This is an excuse for lazy workmanship. And then do everything you can to relieve the driving forces by providing a space in front of your whatever you're using as your water control layer, your WRB. Provide a space in front of that so that you don't get a buildup of pressure, driving the water to the inside, and then wherever you can, build with less moisture sensitive materials. So
I'm,
where appropriate, use plywood instead of OSB, or I don't know, whatever. Do whatever you can. You can't always do that, but the hydrostatic pressure one is the providing a
yeah.
space for drainage and drying is
And I'm
the
not crazy. This
best.
was how the whole EIFS problem back in the 1990s got
Yeah.
remedied. Correct?
Yeah,
They
it was
just
the same issue. It was synthetic stucco adhered to a wall without
no
enough
drainage.
drainage behind it. Or sometimes they didn't even put a WRB behind it because they
Yeah,
assumed, right? They assumed that
right.
the face of the synthetic stucco was all the waterproofing they needed. And
And
they
this is
assumed wrong.
another thing I run into once in a while. I try to tell people like, look, EIFS is just stucco with one extra layer of material in the assembly. It's still stucco. It's just stucco with this insulation in it.
Okay, well, tell me this though. Yes, that's right. But maybe this is just because I've haven't worked on the right kind of building, but you know how plaster walls on the inside of high-end buildings just look so much nicer than painted drywall?
Sounds better too. No, really,
So,
it
oh
does.
really?
Oh yeah,
I
they're
haven't even
completely different.
noticed.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
I'll have to pay attention
noticeable.
to that.
Yeah, I normally tell people like, look, stucco or plaster's great. You're really gonna love plaster for the way it makes your house sound.
No kidding.
Yeah,
Well, I'm gonna have to pay attention to that and
yeah.
start telling people that too.
Oh yeah.
But okay, so you can see that it's different. You can see
Yep.
it's different, right, Mark?
Yes,
It's
definitely.
gorgeous. So on the outside of buildings too, like in the same way, I mean, in a certain sense, like if you're doing a rendering on the inside, you can't tell the difference in the rendering. Usually, plaster, especially smooth plaster versus painted drywall. On the outside of buildings, same story. EIFS, so synthetic stucco, a very thin layer of stucco applied over insulation that's glued to the wall. It just looks different than stucco that's direct, thicker stucco that's direct applied to masonry. And like the masonry one, it just looks so gorgeous. And the eaves, I've never really seen eaves, to my knowledge, that looks anything other than kind of cheap. Ooh, sorry to
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah, you got to layer it up. I mean, I'm the engineer in the crowd here. Like, quite frankly, a lot of fashion and looks things pass me by kind of rapidly. Um, However, I kind of get this one because, as humans, our eyes are sensitive enough to see those differences and sort of comprehend them from our like, life experiences. And you can look at a wall and sort of see like, wow, it's got some
Like
weird,
weight
uh,
to it. It feels
yeah,
heavy.
yeah. And I mean, all you architects are a little better at like articulating that and like, making me believe that it affects your soul and that kind of thing. Me, I'm always just like, oh, that one looks better than that other one, and oh, I can see the joints and the stucco or whatever. But yeah, it makes a difference, no doubt. And that I don't think I ever met an architect that wouldn't prefer to specify, three coat, hard coat stucco versus eaves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So now
I've been
you,
I've been seeing some people in so in Texas where I do a lot of I live in Texas and I do a lot of work here as well. But I haven't seen anybody do this other places. But that doesn't mean they don't. I just haven't worked on a project like this. But they'll build a framed wall so they can essentially do everything the same that they normally would do on the inside, like their services run through of cavity wall, whatever. It's just normal. And then they'll build a CMU wall outboard of that, but it's
Wow.
thinner, like 4 inches, and they'll have masonry ties back to the framed wall. So there'll be like a 2-inch cavity in between the thinner CMU and the backup wall, and that cavity is for drainage, and so they'll drain that cavity, and then they'll direct apply stucco onto the CMU. So
Sure.
they get that plaster look, but without having like a
yeah, whole
full
big old
masonry,
assembly.
super heavy wall. Um,
Yeah,
and it's beautiful. And then the window returns are real deep too. It's really pretty.
I think a lot of that sort of thing happens because of the labor markets and material costs in various, parts of the country. So in other words, my guess is masonry is cheap relative to the cost of doing masonry, in where you are in Texas, it's cheap compared to, for example, where I am in Connecticut. In other words, in Connecticut, people would have a cow if they did that
Oh,
because of the
really?
cost. Oh my God, yeah, crazy expensive.
Really?
But there's other things that happen in other areas of the country. Like I think some of this stuff is like a holdover from cost and general practice. Like here in Connecticut, like we direct apply the drywall to the ceilings and the walls and et cetera. Whereas in Boston, they would put up these little 1x2 furring strips and shim them all like crazy and then blue board it and plaster it. Well, we would never do that in Connecticut because like, again, like you're crazy, the cost. And I think there's probably 100 of these variations across the country. And that one with stucco and CMU is just one of them. Um, yeah,
So I was one of my clients was this is a while back on it was a production builder. And so they're building like a lot of stuff. I mean, it was pretty mid-range price-wise. So it wasn't, these weren't like really, really crappy houses. They weren't, totally custom, right? So they were just mid-range houses. And they were having some problems with their stucco, which is very, very, very common now, like billion-dollar lawsuits. And the problem was exactly this. They didn't have enough drainage behind their stucco, so they were getting a bunch of rot behind their sheathing was rotting out because they had the code mandated minimum of 2 layers of building paper, which, by the way, that's why the code mandates 2 layers of building paper. So the first layer is the water control layer, and the second layer is intended to be the bond break. So it's intended to give you just a little bit of space for drainage and drying to
Little
reduce
gap.
that hydrostatic pressure. Exactly, a little gap.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that doesn't give us enough drainage and drying. The space is too small for a lot of climates. So it works fine in California, but anywhere where you get more than 20 inches of rain a year, that's can be a huge problem. So anyway, this production builder was having this problem, and I told them, okay, well, so first of all, they were doing this on, they built this way on single-story houses for a long time and not had any problems. These little suburban bungalows never had a problem. Well, they started building more townhouse type stuff, and their designs were getting a lot more complex, right? Because people wanted this urban living stuff, so they were living in downtown wherever the heck they were, and they had these, instead of 1-story bungalows, they had these 3- and 4-story buildings, and that were a lot more complex. And then they had this problem, and I told them that the problem was not enough drainage, that to fix it, they needed to make more of a space. So just install a drainage mat over your WRB and go on your way, you're fine. Anyway, drainage mat costs about $1 a square foot. And these guys were like, no way, that is way too much money, that's crazy. And at first I thought that was nuts, because the price point was like $500,000 a house, right? So $1 a square foot on a $500,000 house is not a lot of money. But for them, it was a lot of money, in that they couldn't compare it to the total house price. They were comparing it to the like their profit, and their production home builders make like maybe between 3 and 5%. So that's really small. So they're taking like a $2,000 ad out of a 3% profit on a $500,000 house is a lot more significant, and their competitors weren't doing that. That said, when you compare stucco, like the entire stucco assembly, even with drainage mat, to other cladding types, it was still cheaper, like a lot cheaper than, say, it was cheaper than brick veneer, it was cheaper than all kinds of other claddings. So to me, I went back to them and I was like, well, this is lame. You guys are still, because they didn't want to do the drainage mat. And I said, well, because it's too expensive, but it was still cheaper than other cladding types. And these houses, these production houses, have like 6 different cladding types per house, right? It's crazy. So I looked at this and I was like, well, your solution is to use like you shouldn't use less stucco, use more stucco. Like get your designers to eliminate brick or whatever and use stucco with drainage mat. But they didn't listen to me. They didn't listen. So anyway,
That's a great point.
Was unfortunate.
Christy,
they decided to roll the dice and deal with the lawsuit as opposed to
maybe the guy's brother was a lawyer or something. Who knows? I always wondered how they make those economic decisions.
Crazy. I'm hoping we get it mandated by code, because I think in a certain sense they'd all, if it was mandatory for everybody to do it, you'd stop the consumer from getting hosed on this, because nobody wants to be the first one to take the economic hit, right?
Well,
like,
I'm not crazy.
I'm raise my cost by $2,000, but
that's going through the code cycle right now, isn't it? Isn't that gonna?
I think it'll be in the next iteration, but I'm not sure. I haven't totally been up to speed on it.
About 2-3 months ago, I tried to get myself caught up on this. I was talking to that guy.
up in Boston?
The guy up in Boston about it. And I really tried to do my homework and figure out, like, okay, what is the code cycle and when's it coming up and this, that, and the other thing. And oh my goodness, was it complicated. And it really made me feel inadequate as like a researcher, because I couldn't come up with, I thought I'd be able to know, like, all right, this is gonna be the code on like October 2022. So anyway, it turns out I wasn't as dumb as I thought I was. It's just apparently always
Yeah,
a little bit up in the air. But as far as I know,
complicated.
there is going to be, whenever that next code comes out, some drainage requirements.
Yeah, they're taking a step in the right direction, but these things are always compromises, so it's unlikely that it'll be an actual drainage mat. So what I'd like to see, or what I recommend to all my clients, is at least a 1/4 inch space. So a 1/4 inch minimum 1/4 inch drainage mat over the WRB, whatever it is. If you're in a climate that's got 20 inches of rain or more, or if you're designing anything over 2 stories. You
So
want that drainage mat. But I think the code is going to require like a 3/16 inch space, which can be satisfied by using a textured building wrap. And
okay,
the reason they think this is going to go through is because a lot of the manufacturers, including DuPont, actually already make one of those products. So they'll get it. It's more likely to get approved when you've got manufacturers who already sell something.
yeah. Well, now the typical like cedar breather, or what's that other, the yellow product, home slicker.
Home Slicker, yeah, Slicker
They're
Max.
all 7 millimeters, right? I think, which is
I don't
I
know.
think,
They're a little less than. Oh, they're like the ones that are unfaced, like that. The mesh, they're like
yeah,
they're like a 1/4 inch.
yeah. That's what I thought. I thought like 6 millimeters is almost like it's good. It's close enough to be a 1/4 inch. And I thought those products were 7 millimeters, but maybe they're 6. Anyway, either way, I think I'm okay with them
Well, they're
being a
great because
1/4 inch.
they're thin enough. They're enough to deal with the drainage, give us enough drainage to solve the problem. But they're thin enough that you don't have to redetail everything else, right? Like you don't.
Yeah,
It's not so big that you have to redetail all your returns. Like you don't need you don't need some bigger cladding closure or something like that on the edges. Like everything still works.
yeah. Okay.
Hmm.
What now? So let me get around to one topic that I don't know how anybody deals with, quite frankly. So, stucco cracks. It cracks a lot. And if it cracks a whole lot, then, the contractor gets blamed and everybody's in trouble. And cracks in stucco are one of the ways the water gets past the surface. But the the code requirements are what I'm going to call severe with regard to requirements for movement. In other words, like, I think the ASTM standard on stucco tells you that you can't go more than 12 feet without a movement
Control
joint,
joint, yeah.
which, like, it's rare that anybody really does that, as far as I could tell. And, every movement joint is a new opportunity to get a really bad leak, because, it's just caulked and the caulk always fails, and, blah, blah, blah. How do you deal with that when you're out there either reviewing or, dealing with it while it's going, material being put in place?
I don't know. I probably shouldn't admit this publicly, but I know so little about that. I make it so that there's enough drainage so that if the stucco cracks, it doesn't create a water problem. So take
Yep.
that off the table, and then I have to defer to the expertise of the of. I mean, I'm real serious about recommending that they hire a really good stucco subcontractor to minimize cracking and defer to their
Yeah.
judgment on that. But I don't know. I really I don't know about that stuff. You know, but I
Yeah.
call you.
And
I call Foster.
but because
Foster, what do I need to do?
it gets worse, because then, like, the chemistry of the stucco impacts like how much it cracks, and the
Well,
chemistry of
and
the stuck.
how long they let it sit between applications and.
Yeah, right. Whether they took lunch and left the goo sitting there drying out before yeah, it's crazy. Like
So I
the
saw this beautiful application right before, like the first week into this whole lockdown, and it's a the traditional 3-coat application, but they reinforce it with a little mesh. It was
Okay.
beautiful. I should
Huh.
send you photos. It was just gorgeous.
Mm.
I was like,
Haven't
you should leave it like it was the scratch and the brown coat had been applied, and then they reinforced
the brown coat?
the brown coat, or reinforced. Maybe they put it. I don't know. They were putting more coats on than they needed, but it was. They didn't even have the finish coat up, and I was like, you should just leave it like this. It's gorgeous. Don't paint
Yeah.
it. It's beautiful.
Well, I was involved with one really, really big house where the exterior was all stucco, and it was designed to look like it was limestone. So it was all rusticated, up to like 20 feet above grade. All of the trim was stucco, like everything, the whole place. It all looked like limestone. They did a beautiful job. But I got to admit, it's one of the things I like about stucco is, you could just do everything. All the trim, all the everything,
Yeah.
it's all one material. And if you get a good applicator, it looks beautiful. It looks like limestone. It looks every
Yeah,
bit as good. So
yeah, yeah. I see. Look at that. Haters
I
gonna
know.
hate.
Yeah, not me.
I guess I have a question about how you can make stucco look like multiple materials, but like you were saying, Christine, there's so many, manufacturers that want, or home builders that want to use multiple materials on the facade. And a lot of them aren't actually, they need a cavity. And so when you're actually doing stucco and having to build some sort of cavity in because you're applying like an artisan fiber cement series or something that requires that, how do you recommend that the rest of the stucco wall is done? Do you do that whole stucco wall with a cavity, or?
Yeah, I mean, it happens a lot. You have to. I mean, and that's one of the things that needs to be coordinated. One of the most common examples of this is actually in Florida, where it's really, really common to build the first. So they'll stucco everything in Florida, so the whole house will be stuccoed, but the first floor will be made out of like solid, well, not solid, but CMU blocks. So it'll be a block wall, and then the second story will be wood frames.
Yep.
And they'll want stucco on both, right? So that's
Yep.
fine, but the stucco on the framed wall has to have a drainage space behind it. The stucco on the on the ground floor can just be, it can go right on the block, like just a render right on the block. So in between the two, you need a little through wall flashing that that sort of stops, that closes the cavity at the end and directs the water to the face of the wall. And so you have to do something similar at different transitions, especially the horizontal transitions, right?
Right.
The vertical ones don't matter as much. You just, because you're not really having water that moves laterally across facades, or if it does, you tend to not care that much. But yeah, it's tough. You've got to account for that and make sure that either things are in plane, or that you've got a through wall flashing or some sort of transition to direct water continuously from one plane of drainage to another.
Right.
Now, Mark, if you can pull off some gargoyles there, that's even better, because like what I always worry about is like the dribble.
Scares the water.
Well, so there is this, what I call incidental water that's draining behind your stucco, but it's gone through your stucco. So it's picked up some salts, and then it's picked up whatever goop is, on your WRB and this and that, eventually drains out. But if it then dribbles down your stucco face on your first floor, that can be problematic too, meaning you're going to see it, or it's a wet spot and mold arguably can grow there and that sort of thing. So if you can let it drain out a little bit more and then fall to the ground, even if it's just like an inch, that's better than zero, you know? There was a style of house where the second floor stuck out over the first floor, and I thought it was like to keep Indians from attacking and getting in or this kind of thing. But that's that I would always recommend that, to all you designers. Like, look, let the water drip clear to the ground. Don't let it dribble down the rest of the building.
Right.
I've had increasing increasing worries about staining and that being a source of failure. I mean, most of the forensic projects I have or problems in, anyway, most of the forensic stuff I get called in on is usually pretty bad. Like there's something's rotting, something's not just inconvenient. It's
Not
something
not
like
just a minor
requires
complaint
replacement.
for yeah.
Exactly. But I mean, some staining can move from a minor complaint to a major one if it's across an entire elevation and if it's bad enough, you know.
Well,
Um,
I find if especially if it's a homeowner, you know, a residential project, is once they spend above, you know, 7 digits, it turns out those little imperfections start to look really large.
I don't know
It
though.
really,
You've told me though that it's not always that you get like a certain percentage of that kind of client at
yeah,
every price point if it's residential, right? And
yeah,
I had, because I had an experience where a neighbor posted on Nextdoor. This was before I realized that you should not participate in Nextdoor in a technical professional capacity ever. It's just for lost dogs and fun things. But anyway, I got a message and it was a neighbor and she was having a water problem with her house. And I was like, look, I'm here. Obviously, this was before the lockdown. Why don't you just, I work from home. I'll just come over. I live 2 blocks from you. I'll just come to your house and meet you right now. So I did. And I answered the question she had, the very specific question. It was about the insulation in her attic, the spray foam she had used. She wasn't familiar with it and it was changing color. And I was like, don't worry, it's normal for it to change. But she was worried that there was a problem. There wasn't. It was fine. She was fine. But then she was like, well, while you're here, and she had like, a half a dozen other issues with her house that she asked me about. And we walked around the house and I was like, oh my gosh. 6 out of 6 of her issues were things that were happening today on my house and that I just don't notice, don't care about, don't like, just so far down my list of
oh
things that
yeah,
bother me that I couldn't. I mean, I helped her. Some of them I knew and some of them were like, I have no idea. But
oh yeah.
it was and it was hilarious. It's like, I'm pretty sure that's on my house, but
Yep. Well, Mark, I'll repeat the story for your benefit. So I've probably been involved with, you know,
oh
several
my gosh, this is a great story.
several thousand punch lists in my career. Um, but I've been lucky enough to build for a very wide uh, variety, at least economically, of residential clients.
hmm
So for the last 20 years or so, it's been what I would call a very like the very high end of residential. But
hmm
early in my career, I built um, a number of homeless housing shelters and a very large number of low-income housing projects. In fact, Andrew Cuomo was one of our clients at the time, the current governor of New York. And before that, we were doing work with. I used to meet his father when he was governor, that kind of thing. Anyway, this wide variety of client types. And what I learned over the years is it doesn't matter whether the customer's incredibly wealthy or incredibly poor or in between. There's a certain percentage, about, let's just say, could be between 10 and 30%, that are fantastic clients. They're great no matter what. And there's about the same percentage that are just awful jerks no matter what. Like, you know, no matter how good you built the place, doesn't matter how many millions or how many individual tens of dollars, uh, you know, 30% are just complete jerks, and they're going to make your life miserable. And then the like the 30-40% in between can kind of go either way, depending on, like, you know, how they're feeling that day. But there's
Well,
the money.
tell about the bathroom sink. Do you
Oh
not
yeah,
remember
oh
this?
yeah,
This
oh
is
yeah,
hilarious.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'll tell your story.
This,
I tell this story so much because it's so funny.
go for it.
Okay,
Want
so
me to?
Foster, tell me if I have maybe I've exaggerated it
Oh, it's probably
over the
better. That
years.
would be better.
But that you had this client who you were working, you know, punch list stuff, and she took you into the bathroom and turned on the water of the master bathroom sink and said, and previous to this, she said, I've got this really big problem. So she takes you into the bathroom, turns on the sink, and waits a minute, and you're just standing there like, okay. She says, do you hear that? And you're like, uh, like what, right? And she
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
like the sound that the
Yeah.
water made when it hit the
Yeah.
bowl
The
of the
sink.
sink.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was offensive to her.
Yeah. She's
And
like, you hear
you're
that?
like,
Isn't that
Oh
awful?
my God.
like it's just terrible.
Yeah, you just don't know what to say. You're just like, wow, I'm gonna look into that and I'll get back to you. Like, there's. I wish had more what's it called, EQ or something? I don't know, whatever. Like I don't know what to say to people like that. But I'm gonna tell one other one that's a little different, but I find it was for me always funny. So I was involved with 150 some odd row houses in Coney Island way back years ago, and they're all wood frame, CMU in between, nothing crazy, right? So we'd get some floor squeaks once in a while, and we figured out how to fix them over the years and how to prevent them. And this was back in like when OSB was first becoming a
Before
really big.
Advantech, before the squeak
Oh,
free guarantee.
way before Advantech and all that, right? So I'm pretty old. So anyway, we have this one homeowner who, puts in a punch list complaint, and okay, I send my guy Frank down there. He's fixed a million of these things, no problem. And anyway, he does it. He comes back, and like a few days later, and we get like the repeat of the same complaint. And then this goes on like 3 times in a row. So finally, I'm like, oh, I got to go down there and see what the heck is going on. And Frank is a super nice guy. He's now a police officer down in Puerto Rico somewhere. Anyway, he's like, Foster, I'm telling you, this isn't me. I fixed this problem. This is the homeowner. It is. I'm like, Frank, I don't know what to tell. Like, we got to take care of these people. Like, this isn't that big a deal. Let's just come on. Let's just do it. All right, show me, Frank. So we go to the house, and Frank's like, Foster, I've done this, all these screws, blah, blah, blah. I fixed it. And he's like, watch, look at this. And he walks across the room, right? Nothing. Dead silence. Not a squeak, right? The homeowner looks at us and says, hold on. She walks across the room. The thing sings like it's like there's canaries in a room. It's just like every step. She was tipping the scales at about 350. Frank was
All
only
right.
tipping the scales at about 150.
But didn't the problem turn out to not be that?
No, that was it. She was
That
just
really was it? Oh, man,
she was
that's
putting
sad.
enough pressure on the floor and I said, sorry, Frank, you got to keep working on this.
Oh, man.
But she was in the top 10 nice category. She was a great client and this and that. I found the whole thing hilarious. Poor Frank was like, it's not me.
Oh, man.
Nothing to do with stucco or water, but
I've got one with stucco. Why you should hire professionals. This one, I
okay.
called you on this one actually, Foster. So it was, I got a call from a builder in high-end home, fantastic builder in Dallas. Mostly does new construction work on projects designed by architects. So he's used to that workflow. Really, really great, great guy. Anyway, he got asked to do a repair on a large stucco home. And the home was built 17,000 square feet roughly. It was built in the neighborhood that had the tornadoes come through it in Dallas last year, and so it was not in the direct path of the tornadoes. So it wasn't like this thing was obliterated, but there were some metal panels on some columns that got blown off and whatever, and some stucco cracked. So said the homeowner. So this homeowner said, well, I want you to fix the crack, just patch the cracks in the stucco and it's fine. So the builder gets there and is like, yeah, I don't think this is from the tornado. Takes a look at the stucco, opens up a small portion of the wall, and the OSB, this house is only 4 years old, is completely rotten.
Oops.
Like,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not completely rotten, but it's totally saturated.
Yeah.
You couldn't quite pull it apart with your fingers, but it was wet to the touch. And
Yep.
a 4-year-old house is crazy. Anyway, so he immediately calls me because he's like, I'm not touching this unless I'm doing all of it, but I want to make sure that I'm not, making a mistake on this. So he calls me and I come in and I give my opinion, and it's exactly what we've talked about here, not enough drainage behind the stucco, whatever. But I'm like, what the heck happened with this? And it was this super modern, like such an obnoxious looking house. I mean, like design wise, it's like a giant, like a middle finger to everything that is proper and good. My husband, by the way, we drive by this house on our way to church. My husband loves this house. I hate it. I think he loves it because it's so aggressive. It's
Avant-garde.
an aggressive house. So it's like super tall, like it's 2 stories, but each story, it's probably like each floor is like 14 feet or something. I don't know. It's just very tall, and no overhangs, pure white stucco, and just fair. And then they've got these massive columns in the front with I probably shouldn't describe this in too much detail in case you
Go for
screw
it.
them. You didn't hire me. Screw him. So these massive panels, the columns covered in metal panels, and then the rest of the house is all stuck. I mean, it's so obnoxious. Anyway, the guy, turns out the owner of the house designed it himself and
Oops.
did not hire an architect, and I think even like hired maybe a draftsperson to just draft his grand scheme for this house, and then hired a builder who didn't know anything, basically.
Great. That's a great combo.
Exactly, right. And now 4 years later, everything's rotten. And I called Foster and I was like, describing the wall assembly, and like there were a couple other things that I asked Foster about, and you were very helpful. It was great. But the most important thing you said after we talked about like the technical sort of ins and outs, like how does the wall meet with the roof, whatever, because he had not surprisingly, this man had other problems. Foster's like, wait a second though. You're telling me that this is the same guy, this is a client that drew up the drawings himself and wouldn't hire didn't hire an architect, didn't hire a competent builder. You better make sure you get paid up front. Like, you're not getting this job.
Yeah.
And you were right. I did not get the job.
Yeah.
But I did meet with the owner, and I explained before I did a full investigation. I said, look, if I do an investigation,
You're paying up front.
Well, you're paying up front, and unfortunately, this is news you're not going to like. And my recommendation is almost certainly going to be to reclad and resheathe this house. What an investigation will tell me is, do you also need to reinstall the windows? And what are your terrace to wall connections and your roof to wall connections? So I can draw details up and whatever. And the owner was like, out front asked, well, why do I need to hire you to do the investigation? What if I just do what you're recommending to me now? And I didn't say this out loud, but I was like, so you mean take my professional opinion, but not pay me for my professional opinion?
Yeah.
I said, well, you can do that, but you might end up in the same place that you're in.
All my services have already passed. Hopefully you picked up on absolutely everything I said and all the nuances.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but interestingly, that story I told way back at the beginning of this whole thing about the mid-century modern, I was hired.
Yeah, what'd they do on that house? You showed me pictures of that. They did nothing. They just left it.
They were just like, just replace the window. Like the homeowner kind of recognized, like, wow, they were screwed, for lack of a better word, and they just didn't want to spend all the money, basically. And they couldn't, I guess everybody's insurance policy is different, but I'm not so sure the typical homeowner's insurance policy would cover.
No, I mean, that's the problem with these class action lawsuits now against Toll Brothers in Pennsylvania and Pulte in Florida. And at one of them, they just issued a judgment. It was like a $90 million judgment in this class action lawsuit. It's crazy. But that's the sad part of this, is that people are losing all the equity in their house. Like they don't have $100,000 to reclad
Right.
and
Yeah.
resheathe there and mold mitigate and replace the insulation. And
Right. That was the whole thing on this one. They asked me, like, what do we do? And I'm like, look, sorry, you're going to have to pull off your stucco and redo most of your sheathing and then do it the right way. And in the end, they were just like, no, we're not doing that. Sorry. Just
yeah,
put the windows in, do the best you can, flash it as best you can, and see you later.
Oof.
Well,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Anyway,
It's I love teaching on this topic because it's so interesting. I mean, it's harder in this podcast to, obviously we're all visual, right? So I prefer
yeah,
teaching with with sections and
props.
drawings and pictures. But I love teaching on this topic because it gives so many of the basic principles of water management, and you can apply that to other wall types and all kinds of stuff. And then I like teaching on it also is because people are always interested because they're sort of attracted to, oh my gosh, failure. They're really, people are riveted when I give presentations on stucco at conferences and show them all these pictures of
Oh,
rotting buildings.
nothing better than a car crash.
But then I hate it because it's so sad that it's like real people have to spend real money to fix this stuff. And also that's on the homeowner side, but on the designer side, we unfortunately have this situation where code minimum is not adequate for a lot of conditions.
Yeah,
So that
that's a
means that
great
you can
point.
be a generally attentive person, follow the code, and still wind up with
Yeah,
pretty, I
trouble.
mean, if that's not a catastrophic, I mean, it's not catastrophic in that usually you're not, there isn't a unless it gets really, really bad, you don't have a life safety issue. But causing your client to lose the equity in their house, like
Oh,
how
yeah, yeah,
you feel terrible, and you didn't break a law, and you
yeah.
designed a code.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I haven't done it yet, but I keep thinking I'm gonna create an AIA class on like where the code has it wrong. And that's an
Oh
example,
yeah.
like Stucco is an example of that. Like code ought to be a little better than it is, but there's probably 50 things in the code that are similar, some more serious than others. Like you can still put, sheet polyethylene behind your drywall here in Connecticut. I'm like,
It's
that's just
crazy.
crazy. Like, don't do that. But I see it plenty when I go to do, condition assessments on houses, new houses.
Wow.
Anyway, there's 100 of those examples. But yeah, stucco's a great one.
Yeah,
So
some places they require, well, they don't say sheet polyethylene, but they require a vapor barrier on in cold
yeah,
climates.
yeah, exactly. Well, we should probably wrap this up. Mark, you probably got 1,000,001 questions, I know, but what are we gonna do?
Well, ask one. I don't know
All right,
Yeah,
if you have
I'll
it.
ask one that I don't even know if there's a good answer to it, but if you're walking around and you see all these new multifamily buildings that have stucco, maybe they're in California, wherever, and they're all using vinyl nail fin windows, and everything is just so flat. It's like there's no return on the window, even
Yeah.
no stud. Is there anything that you've seen, any details that you've recommended that help create any sort of depth to the windows?
Yeah, actually I've done a lot of work in California in particular, and they'll my developer partner in this will inset all of their windows. They'll use like wood framing to create
An
an
actual
inset.
inset?
And it's expensive, but
Yeah.
but that super flat look
yeah,
is really tough. The vinyl nail fin windows are actually not that bad. They're
They
in
have
a
like
lot
the
of ways they're
little,
pretty good because they're also like it's a single extrusion often. So the frame and the flange, the fin,
mm-hmm,
are the same piece. It's one solid piece. So
mm-hmm.
if you integrate it with essentially tape it to the sheathing, you actually get a pretty good seal there. If it's a flat facade, you absolutely have to have a secondary head flashing. On my clients often, because it's California and it's relatively dry there, when they inset their windows, they often don't bother with a secondary head flashing, because they'll put the head flashing at the inset.
Return.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it's high risk when you do. You're absolutely right. When you've got something completely flat like that, it's high risk, and the taller the building, the greater the exposure. So that stuff can really get beat up by wind and rain.
Well,
Yeah.
this is the classic architecture issue. Ornament.
Yeah.
Such a
Yeah.
useful thing when you want your water to go somewhere else.
Indeed.
It certainly is.
But Mark, if you're interested, there's a video out there on YouTube somewhere that does a really good job of showing like how to make those inset stucco windows.
Oh,
I don't
I
know
want
if
to see that too.
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
gonna have to go. I'm gonna have to search for that.
yeah, I'll send it to you. Don't worry about it. It's put together by a friend of ours, Christy's and mine, one of her Texas neighbors down there.
Really? Who put it
So
together?
Matt Reisinger.
Oh, yeah. I'll
Yeah,
take a look at that.
it's it's exactly the way you just described it, but it's there's the beauty of YouTube and Instagram these days is we're such a visual industry, and I'm a reasonably good reader, but it turns out I can read better when I can look at pictures. I
Right.
still feel like I'm back in kindergarten, and
Yeah, exactly.
when you see it on a video, you're like, oh, that's how it goes. So now I got it. So anyway. All right. Well, we should probably wrap this up. I don't want to take everybody's entire evening. That was fun for me. Hopefully,
That
you
was
guys
great.
enjoyed it. I
Yeah,
feel like
yeah.
Stucco, we could go on and on and on forever, but that's fun enough for me. So, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Christy.